All right, we are here on chapter 3. We're going to dive in equal employment opportunity. You can see the screen. Um, this is usually it's 2 lectures and it's a lot of material. When you think about HR, a lot of people think of things like discrimination or cases, Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll talk about that today, stuff like that, diversity. And so this has been really shortened. But I think we're going to try to hit the high points so conceptually we kind of understand what's going on as we go through. So let's get after it here. Beginning with kind of the principle, the question that comes up a lot. Does diversity enhance firm performance? So here's the idea that everyone's told kind of when they're, I don't know, when they're in 5th grade or something. We all hold hands. We all come from different perspectives and different cultures and see different things, and we all hold hands and we sing Kumbaya and everything is great. But then reality sets in, and you look at the news, or you see discrimination lawsuits, or you see history of all nations, including the United States, with different forms of gender or race discrimination, and you go, wait a second. Maybe it's not that clear. Maybe it's not that easy. So this guy set out, his name is Scott Page, he's a mathematician at the University of Michigan, and he basically set out to generate a mathematical theorem to argue for the benefit of diversity. And it's a neat model, and it's generated a lot of conversation. And the idea, the basic logic of it goes something like this: if you have a whole bunch of people, if there's the whole world's knowledge, okay, imagine like a circle here, the whole world's knowledge, and a whole bunch of different types of people that know different aspects of that knowledge, and if they together generate a solution to a complex problem or work together or whatever, they're going to have more of the world's information than maybe even a super smart person, but 10 of the same kind of super smart people that know the same stuff. And he argues for it. And he does a good job arguing for it, a really good job. And then in response, Catherine Klein and I think a guy named Dave Harrison responded and basically said, yeah, Scott, like your model makes sense, and we've been told this before, and we know this to be true. The problem is when you get a team together that is wired different assumptions, different ways of communicating, different culture, different perspectives, they don't always get along very well, and they don't share information very well. And they cite 30 years of research in what's called social identity theory that basically says people tend to hang out with people who are more like them. People tend to work better with people who are more like them. The communication is similar. The nonverbal communication, I don't mean like language, I mean nonverbal communication, meaning behind words, and so trust is established more quickly. And so I think the title of their paper was something like tidy logic and messy reality. So I think kind of a bottom line here is, does diversity just automatically plug it in? Does diversity enhance performance? No. But can diversity enhance performance? Absolutely. It depends on how you manage it. And a lot of how you manage it will land in the lap of a manager, specifically a human resource manager. So as we go through, I want to keep this in mind. We're going to go through basically a bunch of laws today, but the big premise or the big idea is it's absolutely a competitive advantage to have diversity and to do it well. One of the assumptions that was in Scott Page's model is the concept of inclusion. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take 10 different types of people and throw them in a room and get them to solve a problem. Well, chances are the loud extrovert is going to come up with the idea and implement it. The challenge is in HR, how do we create management systems, hiring systems, compensation systems, promotion systems that are inclusive, that actually get those 10 different people in that room to submit their perspective and their idea, and do so in a constructive and a trusting way. So that's where the challenge lands in our lap in terms of managing diversity. So EEO, you've probably heard the term before, equal employment opportunity. A lot of it's based around the idea of unlawful discrimination. What is unlawful discrimination? It's discrimination on anything, particularly in the work context, that violates some kind of a law, a federal, state, local, whatever law, or a common law doctrine. And so discrimination isn't the issue. Like if you're dating someone, you discriminated against other people, and if you choose an IPA over a lager, you're discriminating based on your taste and the clothes we put on. And I mean, whatever. We discriminate all the time. The question is the context of which we do it and on the grounds for which we do it. So if I'm hiring someone and I hire the person who I think is the best performer, I discriminated based on my anticipation of their performance. That's appropriate. You're hiring someone to perform well at the job. The question is, what did you discriminate on, and in what context? So a lot of different laws written on age, color, race, ethnicity, disability, even genetic information, military status. You can see a bunch of them. We'll go through them. National origin, pregnancy, race, religion, sexual orientation. We'll talk about that as well. It's at a state level, certain state levels, Washington State being one of them, but not at a federal level. All right, guys, got to do a little interruption here. It's how fast stuff changes in employment law. So I just said in the lecture that employment discrimination based on sexual orientation was not considered illegal discrimination at a federal level, but many states and cities, I think 18 states at the time, had that passed. That is no longer the case as of, 9 months ago, 10 months ago, something like that. Supreme Court case ruling. If you want to know about the details of the case, feel free to get a hold of me. But case ruling now applies sexual orientation as a protected class under Title VII law. So it's not a new law. It's an interpretation of the law, which is what the judicial branch does. The Supreme Court says that is now a protected class category under the original 1964 Title VII laws. So all the statutes, all penalties, all procedures, everything apply. So I wanted to leave the old one in and make this interruption so you can see that stuff happens quick. And now let's get back to it. Here's equal employment opportunity. This is what we're going for. Employment that's not affected by illegal discrimination. We want legal discrimination based on who is fit for the job, who can do the job. What we don't want is illegal discrimination saying, well, this person's the best candidate for the job, but hey, boy, she's 6 months pregnant. I mean, we're going to hire her and then she'll be gone after a little while, so I don't want to hire her now. Well, no, that's illegal discrimination. Basically saying, yeah, you've earned this job, you're the best one, but because you decided to have a family, then we're taking it away from you. So that would be considered illegal. Status blind is usually what managers kind of prefer. Sometimes there's managerial anxiety around this topic. Managers like, man, can't talk about race, can't talk about gender, can't talk about any of it. I'll probably get sued because they've probably seen or read horror stories and haven't been trained in it well. So usually managers prefer this concept. Like, I'm not looking at anybody's individual differences. I'm only looking at who can do the job the best. It's a great principle. It's really difficult to execute. For instance, like you guys have seen me in a couple lectures here. It doesn't take too much thought to figure out that I probably identify as male, that I'm probably somewhere late 30s, early 40s. Careful, it's late 30s. You've probably seen me like this a couple of times, so you see I've got a wedding ring on. I mean, so we get information from people that we say, oh, I'm not going to get any of that information. I'm just going to look at it, see if they're a good performer. You can't help but get information. The question isn't if you get it. The question, of course, is if you use it. And using it is when it becomes problematic. That's a good reminder for everybody to turn their phones off right there. Sorry about that. Okay, one other comment before we get in. There's a labor economist by the name of Thomas Sowell. He's Hoover Institute, Stanford, crazy smart guy. And he argues about the cost of discrimination, right? And usually people think if a company is discriminatory in some way, and whether on purpose or on accident, there are two different models which we'll look at. But what they're doing is they're hurting themselves financially. And most of us would respond to that and be like, well, yeah, of course, because they get sued for a couple $1 million or a class action lawsuit. And that's not what he's saying. He's saying, no. If you have a labor pool, think of it, it's like basic supply and demand. Let me use just an egregious example. So if I said, okay, I'm here in Ellensburg, Washington, and I run a hop farm, and I only am going to hire Mexican workers or Hispanic workers. Let's go more broad, just because of our geopolitical environment here in Central Washington. So Hispanic workers between the ages of 20 and 40, because boy, I've had good experience, and boy, they really know how to work. So that's what I'm gonna hire. Thomas Sowell would say, you just artificially reduced the supply of labor by saying you're not going to consider any other age category, any other racial category, and if it's gender, I don't know if I said that in their gender category. So you just reduce the amount of people you are willing to hire from. Well, basic economics says when the supply of something is lower, the cost of that commodity, or in this case labor, is going to be higher. So if I'm willing to hire from anyone in the world, that labor is pretty cheap. If I'm willing to hire from anybody in the United States, that labor is more expensive. And the smaller that I make that potential pool of labor, the more expensive that labor becomes. Anyway, bottom line, his argument, he says, discrimination costs you money, doesn't make business sense, even if you don't get caught, because the cost of labor is just going to go up, eating away at your profits or ability for firm survival. So who kind of enforces this or decides this? So there's a few different categories, but in a simple way, there's federal statutes, federal laws, which we'll go through. That is something, either executive order by the president, affirmative action would be an example of that, executive order 11246, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by the House and the Senate, signed by the president. And then there's state laws. We have in Washington State the Human Rights Commission. They are the ones that crank out a bunch of those laws. We have city governments. The city of Seattle says, hey, we're going to have $15 an hour minimum wage, or whatever it is. So there's several different levels and places it would come from, and each of those have their own unique enforcement mode. So for an executive order 11246 is enforced by the OFCCP. Civil Rights Act of 1964 is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So like different enforcers and interpreters and regulators at each point. The last one, which we'll talk about, is courts. In a sense, courts kind of make their own laws in how they interpret the law. So sexual harassment is a great example of that. Sexual harassment was not written into the law in the 1964. But it is a common law doctrine, meaning this is how courts have consistently interpreted the law. So at this point, it's pretty much a law, even though it wasn't clearly passed by the legislature in that way. So two different types of unlawful discrimination. Think of it like categories. Basically, two different ways that we screw up as managers or as companies. One of them is called disparate treatment. This one is the most egregious. It's usually intentional. It's not usually like a big group of people. Like you normally wouldn't get a class action lawsuit, which is like a whole class of people suing because of disparate treatment. Usually it's one person. So I applied for tenure and promotion at my university, and they said, no, we're not going to hire you because you're gay, and we don't want to promote you for that reason. Okay, that was specific, that was intentional, that was direct, that was one person, it was totally on purpose. So that's what we call disparate, or some people say disparate, whatever, treatment. Means I'm treating you disparately, differently, and negatively compared to everybody else. And the underlying reason for that is something that is protected legally. So if I say I am firing you because you're not showing up for work, you might go, hey, that's disparate treatment. You go, well, you're not showing up for work. Like that's not a protected class, right? But if somebody's treating someone differently and negatively based on some protected class characteristic, then we go, yep, that's illegal, can't do that. The next one is a bit more broad, and I have more like personal experience doing cases with disparate impact versus disparate treatment, mainly because disparate treatment is usually it's pretty clear. It was like that was just a dumb move. You said something wrong. It was illegal. It was unfair. And disparate impact happens much more unintentionally. It's like a policy that's made that negatively affects a particular group of people for whatever reason. So this first came out, Griggs versus Duke Power in 1971, and basically Duke Power said, look, to have a job here, you have to have a high school graduation, whatever, diploma, and get a certain score on an IQ test. And it was a policy that seemed like it makes sense to them. And for most people, it's like, yeah, it makes sense. You You need to have kind of a base level of IQ to be able to work here. And showing us that you graduated high school shows us that you can actually complete something. You can put the work in and finish it, or whatever the logic they came up with. So most people look at that and go, yeah, that makes sense. That's okay. So they were sued, taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, no, there's disparate impact here, and you never actually proved that those two things, high school diploma and IQ, were related to the job in the first place. So they might be fine, but you never actually proved they were connected, so you can't use it. So Duke Power comes back and says, okay, I see your point. I get it. I'm making this conversation much faster. It was longer than this, but I see your point. I get it. You know, we did this thing. We shouldn't have done it, but we didn't mean to do it, right? So you can't just like slap us with a bunch of big fines. I mean, it seemed like a good test. We were just trying to, do the right thing for our company. It negatively impacted a group of people. We see it now. We won't do it again, but it wasn't on purpose. Supreme Court came back and said that lack of intent to discriminate is not a defense if discrimination exists. So in my class, if I gave every woman a D and every man an A, and I went through my process to do it, and it looked like a good process, but it had this kind of outcome, people will go, no, wait a second, that's disparate impact. You have some policy in there that treats women differently and negatively, whether on purpose or on accident. It impacted a particular group of people. And if I said, well, yeah, but like you can't fire me because I didn't do it on purpose, no, they would come back and say, you gave people D's. Like saying I didn't mean to doesn't change their grade. Like that's not okay. So lack of intent to discriminate is no defense if discrimination actually exists. Okay, a few EEO concepts. We'll run through each one of these so we get it. These are the big ones. So business necessity. You can think of it like this. There's basically two ways in which you can discriminate based on a protected category in a way that otherwise would be illegal, but there are two hall passes. There are two excuses that are legally justified. I'm not sure a better way to say that. One of them is business necessity. So I'll give you an example of that. So the test to be a firefighter, you throw on an oxygen tank and hoses, and you run up and down 3-4 flights of stairs, and you have to do it in a certain period of time or else you don't get the job. Well, that discriminates against women on average. And again, we're making huge average claims here. There's a ton of women who can do it and can beat the crap out of me. I probably couldn't do it anyway. But it has to do with physical strength and biology, and that test discriminates against women. And so you look at that and go, hey, wait a second, that's disparate impact because it discriminates on the basis of gender, which it does. And fire departments come back and say, hey, look, I don't care someone's gender. What I care about is when the building is on fire, you can get there and drag out a kid before they die. And this test is related to what they would actually do on the job. This is where Duke versus Griggs versus Duke Power, the last case we did. This is what they didn't do. They didn't prove it, where fire stations have proven it. So that would be an example where it looks like there's discrimination, and there is discrimination, but it is legal discrimination because it's what we would call a business necessity. The second exception for this is a thing called, let me turn this down, is a thing called the BFOQ, or bona fide occupational qualification. The simplest example that people use on this is a restaurant called Hooters. So you have kitchen workers who, they've been sued like 3-4 times, who sue Hooters to say it is gender discrimination that men are not allowed to serve tables, especially at the prime times, right, where you make the most money, Friday night, Saturday night, etc. We should be able to do that too, and they sue based on gender discrimination. And Hooters comes back and says, yes, you're right. It is gender discrimination, and it's legal. The name of our restaurant is Hooters. There is a bona fide occupational qualification. You have to have a certain set of equipment to be a server. So, yes, it is gender discrimination. Yes, gender discrimination is illegal. But in this case, there is a BFOQ, a bona fide occupational qualification for why it's okay to discriminate. This happens from time to time on age as well, but there is no BFOQ for race. So for instance, you might go to a local Chinese food restaurant and apply, and they say, no, we're not going to hire you. And you notice that everybody who's working there at least looks Asian to you. And you go, hey, wait a second, that's race discrimination. The restaurant should not say, well, yes, you have to look Asian to serve Asian food because we want to give our customers an authentic experience. They should not say that because that's illegal. That's race discrimination. Do they do that? They probably do. Probably lots of restaurants do that. Is it illegal? Yes, it is. So why don't we hear about it getting challenged? I don't know. Probably doesn't happen on a massive scale, is why. It's usually smaller companies. You can always tell, like, follow the money, right? A lot of these major lawsuits that changed rulings or that brought about laws were usually pretty big in big companies, so you have a big high-end team of lawyers chasing it down. No one is usually going to sell kind of or sue the mom and pop pho shop down the street. They'd sue Panda Express as an alternative. They have deeper pockets. So anyway, those are the two exceptions to it, two exceptions to discrimination laws. And okay, burden of proof. Burden of proof is fun. That switched in 1991. So the burden of proof means the burden, so you kind of want to avoid that if you can. The burden is on you to prove something happened. So if a student in my class said, hey, James ran over my dog, they have to actually prove that. I don't have to prove that I didn't run over your dog. You have to prove that I did run over your dog. So the burden of proof is on you. It's slightly different in cases of employment discrimination. So if I accuse my employer of discrimination of some way or sexual harassment or something, it's kind of the idea they're innocent until they're proven guilty. Sort of. When I accuse them, if I can provide a little bit of evidence, circumstantial evidence, or maybe I have a witness or something, then the burden of proof shifts. It shifts to the organization. So now the organization has to defend that they didn't do it rather than me trying to argue that they actually did do it. Organizations, lawyers will avoid as much as possible getting the burden of proof on them. Proving you didn't do something is really hard. Like I'm saying, you discriminated against me based on religion. And I have some friends who kind of agree with me, and there was a comment made about a Bible in an interview that I had, and that's why I think I didn't get the job. And you might say, well, you didn't get the job because you're not qualified. Well, now you actually have to prove it. You as the organization have to prove you're innocent. I no longer have to prove that you're guilty. So burden of proof is a big, expensive deal, which is why you hear a lot about companies will settle. They're like, we're not going to fight this in court. It takes too much time to argue we didn't do something wrong. We're going to write the person a check and make them go away. Okay, retaliation. Retaliation, we talked about that a little bit in Sarbanes-Oxley. The idea is if somebody makes an allegation toward my company, legally, I need to avoid any kind of retaliatory measure. Okay, this might sound like common sense. Yeah, we get that. Somebody has a right to, make an accusation or whatever. But if I'm a manager of a group and I have 10 employees and one employee in that group accuses me of sexual harassment, I probably don't want to talk to them. I don't want to talk to them about their work while the investigation is going on. And let's say the investigation goes through and it comes out, no, Avi wasn't guilty, he didn't do anything wrong, it was just a misunderstanding or whatever it is. I still don't like that person. That person drug my name through the mud. They hurt my credibility. They've hurt my career. And I want to retaliate against it. I want to give them low performance ratings. I want to fire them. I want to get them off of my team. And so this might seem like, duh, we don't retaliate. But it is in our nature, like as humans, if you get punched, to punch somebody back, right? And so this is very difficult, as you can see by the EEOC claims. You hear a lot about race lawsuits, gender lawsuits, disability lawsuits, but the number one type of case that the EEOC takes on is actually retaliation. In all categories, somebody exercised their right to complain, make an accusation, ask a question, and they were retaliated against by their company. So big area for HR managers and line managers that we train them in. No retaliation. Okay, here's the big law. Civil Rights Act of 1964, also called the Title VII laws, also called the Civil Rights laws. There's a lot of things that it's called. But this is a very big, broadly sweeping law. happened in 1964. If you remember your civics or your United States history lessons, that should tell you, right? The 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, Martin Luther King, a lot of civil rights transition in the United States. And so this was the big law that said, hey, you can't discriminate on hiring or firing or compensation or work assignments based on a lot of things. Race is the one that stands out because that's kind of what the law was initially written for, but included, you know, gender, race, national origin, religion is in there. Religion is somewhat like kind of a common law doctrine that it's tied to national origin. It's not clear on that, but it's in the law anyway now. So very broad. This is the one, like if a company's going to get sued for, you know, millions of dollars, this is usually the law. This law carries what's called punitive damages, meaning if you fire me for a reason that's illegal or improper, right? It's called wrongful discharge, and I sue, and you have to bring me back now. I get back pay, salary, back pay, benefits, but I also get what's called punitive, meaning punishment damages. So if I make $100,000 a year and I was out of work for 6 months, you might give me 50 grand to make it up, but you're going to pay me a couple million because you discriminated based on X, something else. That's the punitive damages. This one scares the heck out of HR people and lawyers, quite obviously. Applies to private employers, 15 or more employees. I had a question. I was consulting with a client here in Washington State recently, and they said, okay, does this mean that if we have less than 15 employees, we can discriminate based on race? And I said, well, it's kind of an odd question. If that's something that you want to do, go ahead and tell me because I'm leaving. But technically, no, even legally in Washington State, because you have the Human Rights Commission, which goes to 8 employees. And they said, well, if we had less than 8 employees, is when I said, shut up. But anyway, you get the idea. It applies to most employers, certainly all large employers. Educational institutions, private, public, you can read it. But where this comes up often, which we'll talk about some cases here in a minute, is the educational institutions. Universities often have various types of affirmative action programs, which we'll deal with here in a second. Here it is, affirmative action. So, what is affirmative action? You can see in the title itself, it's action taken to deal with or to affirm or repair past injustices. So, in a sense, the idea or the purpose of affirmative action is to say, what's in here at my company looks like what's out there in the labor pool. Meaning in Ellensburg, Washington, if I am hiring for baristas at Starbucks and 51% of the Ellensburg population is female, then I would expect on average, flipping a coin, that 51% of the baristas in Starbucks would be female. And if 15% of the population is Hispanic, I would expect 15% of the baristas are Hispanic. So it's just what's in here, the composition of our organization looks, I'm going to be precise, like right on, but pretty darn close to what's out there that is in the labor pool. You can see some of the challenges. If you're hiring for an engineer in Ellensburg, the labor market for engineers in Ellensburg is not the city of Ellensburg. It's probably the state of Washington or maybe even like the Pacific Northwest. So the labor pool doesn't just mean the city that it's in. It means where do you go for that type of person. I had the beginnings of a lawsuit once at Boeing. We were hiring for a unique blend of engineer called a crew ops engineer. They had to be a professional pilot. No, sorry, he was a human factors engineer. They had to be a professional pilot. They had to have a degree in psychology, and because they design like the cockpit, right? So how pilots would think, and they had to, of course, have an engineering degree so they could design all the parts and the components. And I had a nice conversation with the OFCCP, who basically said, hey, it looks like there's discrimination in this area. And I said, well, where do you have that I find these people? And like, well, we looked at the demographics of Everett, Washington. I'm like, what are you talking about? There are no human factors engineers in Everett, Washington, except for the ones that are at Boeing. Like, there's only two programs in the nation that make these people. So you can kind of push back and go, this is where I go to find this type of job, and that's what I'm using for my affirmative action plan. But again, you get the idea of the objective. is my company looks like the labor market. And what the plan is just a document. It just means this is how we're going to try to make that happen. So if my company looks like what's in the labor market, like I'm hiring people and it looks pretty consistent, my affirmative action plan is a one-pager that says, here's our data, we're pretty comfortable with it, here are the things that we are doing to make sure we keep this kind of success going. Thank you very much. Love, company. And it's done. Affirmative action has had some blowback. The reverse discrimination, the first one, I think 70s, early 80s, back versus University of California. Really cool story. This guy, Minnesota, I think Minnesota undergrad, he's a Marine in the Navy. That's right, Marine in the Navy. Marine in Vietnam for several years. Came back, went to work at NASA as an engineer and has always wanted to get into medicine. So he was rejected. At first it was for age, and he was rejected for a whole bunch of stuff to get into med school. And finally he kind of finds out at the end, like wait a second, my MCAT score was like a 72 or whatever it was. The average MCAT score that was brought in was 69. Mine was a 72, and you brought people who were MCAT score of 33 because they were non-white. And he goes, man, that's not right. So got a team of lawyers and sued. And when it kind of went to court, the ruling was it's not a problem that the University of California Med School used race. It's a problem because they had a quota for race with lower scores, and back got accepted into the program. Two other big ones, Hopwood versus State of Texas, University of Michigan. You can check them out if you want to. But the bottom line is when people think of affirmative action, they usually think of anybody non-white, maybe non-male, and maybe between the ages of 18 and 40. Well, here's the deal. It's illegal to discriminate based on gender, right? I have a gender. I don't think the law was necessarily written with that in mind, because at the time, certainly discrimination was much more for women. But if you discriminate against me based off of gender, it's still discrimination based off of gender. If you discriminate against Back because he's white, it's still discrimination based on race. So the idea here is, just because it doesn't fit into a minority category doesn't mean the law doesn't apply into that particular situation. So that's reverse discrimination. Usually if there's kind of quotas, like we're going to hire 100 people, but 30 of them have to be Hispanic. If that kind of hard and fast quota, that's going to be illegal. Philosophical challenge, just a short, quick comment on this. This is where a lot of kind of the rhetoric and the discussion and the debates happen, and they're fun, they're robust debates. For some people, equality means equality of outcomes. For some people, equality means equality of opportunity to get those outcomes. Meaning, if I just paid everybody at my company a flat rate of $100,000 a year, that's equality of outcomes. If I gave everybody at my company, if I paid for a master's degree in accountancy or engineering or whatever, so if you want to go do the work, I will give you that opportunity. Everybody gets that opportunity to go do that. That would you say more is equality of opportunity. The weird case of universities that have bumped into lawsuits around affirmative action and EEO is because universities are both an outcome and an opportunity. So it's kind of a challenge. Who gets into a university is an outcome, like who gets in, right? But it's also an opportunity for future growth. Getting into Central Washington University or Harvard, they're very similar institutions. Getting into Harvard is an opportunity. But we also look at statistics and numbers of who gets accepted into Harvard. And if it's 95% X, 95% men, doesn't matter what you put there, you would go, well, wait a second, that doesn't really reflect the population very well. So it looks like the outcomes are unjust. Further, that's an opportunity, so that means the opportunity is also unjust. Anyway, it's just a fun debate, goes back and forth. You can figure out where you stand on that if you want to. I read this book a little while ago. This guy, Barry Wolf, he wrote a book called A Little Black Book of HR. It's full of kind of stories and principles. Thought it was interesting. And he was asked a question in an interview. He said, does any form of a discrimination like overtly happen today, or it happens at a high level? Is there sexual orientation and gender and race and religion? Like, do all those discriminations happen? You bet they do, right? 330 million people, whatever it is, I don't know, in the United States. it's going to happen. There's certainly going to be incidence rates. But the question was more like, is there any that people don't try to hide? And he said, yeah, there is. It's age discrimination. And age discrimination, once a person hits 50, 60, 70, they start going, ooh, you know what we need? We need fresh ideas. You might need fresh ideas, but that's code word for we need a younger person in that role. We'll get to age discrimination a little bit more, but I thought that was an interesting anecdote. All right, we are 34 minutes in. All right, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I might do a little slide skipping. I just want to make you aware of a bunch of laws. So the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, as it sounds, you can't discriminate against somebody who's pregnant. Family Medical Leave Act, up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. If you qualify for it, you have to work a certain number of hours and be there, employed there for at least 12 months. But if you qualify for it, you get in a car wreck or something, you can't go to work, you get to keep that job, or you have to take care of a sick relative, whatever, you get to keep that job. It's unpaid leave. You can go back to it. Equal Pay Act, that was about gender discrimination. Equal Pay Act actually passed in 1963, so it was just before the Civil Rights Act. Had to basically do with equal pay for equal work. Further regarding gender issues, there's a term glass ceiling and glass elevator. You're probably familiar with them. Glass ceiling basically says that in this company or this industry or whatever it is, women specifically can get promoted to a certain point but no higher. They can't get to the C-suite, meaning corporate executives. C-suite is like CEO, CFO, CHRO, COO, stuff like that. So that would be a glass ceiling. A glass elevator is where, yes, women can be in the C-suite in marketing and HR, but not in operations and finance. In certain areas, it's okay. In certain areas, it's not. There's a history of this. There's certainly been a lot of advancement on this in the future. And this is a super like robust discussion when you start looking at data and impact. When men and women come out, women usually make a higher salary than men. And that typically goes, this is a Bureau of Labor Statistics, that typically happens until about age 30, and then you see a quick break. Well, most people look at that and go, well, quite obviously, that's taking a break from a career to have kids. And on the other side, people argue, go, no, that's not the case. That's when they would get into the higher level positions and then get held back. So your experience, I'm sure, is unique, and perspective is unique, but I do want you to know those two terms. Washington State already has that. All right, sexual harassment. A couple things on sexual harassment. If I go to my secretary tonight or tomorrow at work and I say, hey, Maxine, you want to go out for a date on Friday? And she says, you mean like a meeting? Actually, she's Irish, so she'd say it's really cool Irish accent, you mean like a meeting or something like that. And I would go, no, a date. And she'd go, James, that's awkward because, you're married and I'm married. And no, we're not going to do that. I say, okay. And I go back to work. Is that sexual harassment? No, that's not sexual harassment. If I ask her again on Monday and on Tuesday and Thursday and Friday and for the next couple weeks, yeah, that's like, dude, take a hint, shut up. That's sexual harassment. Or if I'm commenting on what she looks like consistently. If she comes into work and I say, hey, Maxine, I like your pantsuit. That's fine. If I'm commenting on what she's wearing every day when she walks in, that's not so fine. So it's kind of, it's a bit difficult to nail down exactly what it is. There's certain things that are clear, like if you slap somebody on the butt, yes, that's not just sexual harassment, that's sexual assault at that point. If you say, hey, if you sleep with me, I'll give you a raise, yes, that's called a quid pro quo. That's illegal sexual harassment. But you can see there's a lot of gray areas. But there's two specific types I certainly want you to be aware of. One is quid pro quo. It's a Latin term that just means this for that. And the other one is a hostile work environment. The one that people are probably most familiar with is the hostile work environment. And that is, I had a TDI, a turbo diesel Volkswagen Jetta several years ago. And I took it into the mechanic shop and I wanted to speak to the mechanic who was in it. It was this back room, a bunch of cars up. And the lady from the counter, like call service, whatever, I said, can you take me back there? I can go see this guy. I want to talk to him. So we walk back there, and she's in, like, you know, high heels, skirt, professional appearance. And she walked in, and that place lit up like fireworks. They were hooting and hollering and everything. And I asked her, I said, does that bother you at all? She says, oh, no, you know, it's kind of cute. Is that sexual harassment? In that moment, the answer is no, it's not. Because the definition of sexual harassment is unwanted sexual advances. And she said, no, I kind of like it. And I got to thinking, like, all it takes is for her one day to wake up and go, that's not okay. Like, that bothers me at work and I can't focus on my job, so stop. And then it becomes sexual harassment quickly. So that's a hostile work environment. Jokes, touches, whatever. A quid pro quo usually doesn't happen clearly. It's almost always a male supervisor and a female subordinate. It can go both ways. Sexual harassment is same gender, same level, cross level. I mean, you can, any customers, suppliers, people coming in, owners. So anybody can kind of sexually harass anybody and have it be sexual harassment. Most of the cases are male supervisors, female subordinates. And if a male supervisor says to a female subordinate, like you want to go on a date, or I think you're cute, or whatever, or tries to kiss her, she's in a situation like, do I kiss him back as my boss? And that person decides my salary and my promotion. So there's a lot on the line here. So the manager never said, hey, you know, make out with me, or let's hook up and, you know, Netflix and chill, and you're going to get a raise or a promotion. Like, it was never actually said, but just by the nature of their position, right? A supervisor and a subordinate, it was implied. So a lot of managers thinking, gee, I think she really likes me, just get roasted on this because they're not seeing the power differential and the implications of it. That's a quid pro quo. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of a rough summary. All right, so what do we do about it? Obviously, I have a sexual harassment policy. The biggest mistake that firms make is not asking enough questions. If it looks like it's a relationship, dive in and be like, hey, everything okay there? Like, are you comfortable with it? You don't have to say, you know, tell me your darkest secrets about how you feel, but like, are you comfortable with what's going on? If they say yes, it's great. But if there's an allegation or a complaint of sexual harassment, like this would be my advice, like young managers, especially, young might be the wrong word, inexperienced managers, young in their career, and HR people, is when somebody's going to make a complaint about sexual harassment, you've already been trained that you have to take that seriously. You need to investigate. You got to figure it out, take disciplinary action, etc. But very rarely, matter of fact, I don't know if it's ever happened to me in my career where someone has come up and said, I'd like to file a claim of sexual harassment. I believe it was hostile work environment and violated the civil rights law of 19... No. It's not. It's going to be like this. Someone going, yeah, I think he likes me. It's kind of awkward. Done. Like, that's your cue to be respectful and respect privacy, but you need to pry in and figure out, is this a hostile work environment? Do you feel like you don't want to go to work? Like, work sucks because every time you show up, you get flirted with. Is that what's going on? Well, what happened after work? And you finally said, yes, I went out for drinks. And then, okay, so what happened there? So my point is, if it even brings it up, it's kind of awkward, or I'm kind of uncomfortable, or something like, yeah, he asked me out, and he's my boss, obviously, so I said yes. Like, any of those, that's your cue to go, all right, we gotta figure out, make sure everybody's comfortable with what's happening, because if not, you're looking at sexual harassment and probably a hurt employee, and maybe a manager who needs to be retrained to understand a few boundaries. Okay, disabilities. Most people know about the ADA. That's why if you are a builder, you have all kinds of codes, building codes, and wheelchair ramps, and elevators, and all that kind of stuff. That came from the ADA, but one particular section of the ADA is about discrimination against people with disabilities, and what's called a reasonable accommodation for how we deal with that. It is enforced by the EEOC. Someone is considered disabled to have one of three things: physical or mental challenge that greatly reduces the ability to perform or important life functions. So, like, the buzzword here is it limits a major life function. If you have diabetes, your pancreas doesn't work, that's a life function. Maybe asthma, you can't breathe, or sleep apnea, you can't sleep, or you're legs amputated, you can't walk. I mean, like anything that you go say an important life function or a major life function. If you have anything, glasses, seeing. If you can't see without glasses under the ADA, which is the update, you are considered a person with a disability. So that's number one. It's very broad. Number two, possesses a record of such a challenge, meaning, yeah, I used to be overweight and I had sleep apnea. I use that example because that was an employee that I had. But I lost 150 pounds and now I don't have sleep apnea anymore. Well, that's just fine, but if the person is continually falling asleep at work and stuff like that, just because that person says, I don't have sleep apnea, there's a record, there's a history there that suggests it might be something else happening. So that person would immediately kind of be considered as having a disability, even if they say they don't. The last one is thought to have such a challenge. I had a situation with an employee where his wife was emailing me saying, something's not right, like I think it could be this, I think it could be this. Wasn't even a note from the doctor. I then take that and go, somebody is considered to have such a challenge. So now that kicks in the next step, which is called an interactive dialogue. Warren, I noticed you fell asleep. Yeah, I was just up late. I'm tired. Okay, let's talk about that. Like, how can I help you? Is there anything I can do? And if he's not getting it, I might even use the word like, is there an accommodation? That's a buzzword people usually know. Is there an accommodation I can make for you? And he's like, oh, I see where you're going here. So that is a required conversation that we have called the interactive dialogue. And then you figure out what are the main essential job functions that you have, and what are some ways we can reasonably accommodate you. For one of the guys, the sleep apnea guy, it's just what's fresh in my head right now, it was an alternative work shift. So rather than just working 8 hours straight through, he did 3 hours, whatever it was, 3 hours, and then a 2-hour break. He would go and go swimming, come back and do 3 more hours, take an hour break and go for a walk, and then come back and finish the last hour. Made for a long work day. He was exercising. He was healthier, fit with his family situation. Just an alternative work schedule. Like it wasn't a crisis. There's a lot of different ways you can make accommodations, but that's it. What are the essential job functions? And then how do we figure out how to accommodate someone to get them qualified for those particular job functions? And in some cases, we can't. We can't do it. So let's say there's a Victoria's Secret model who is in her backyard with a chainsaw, which is kind of weird, but let's just go work with me on this. And they're cutting, and she cuts one of her legs clean off. Okay, a prosthetic leg for a Victoria's Secret model may not work anymore. So we go, there actually isn't a reasonable accommodation. I guess they have like airbrush stuff. I don't know. You get my point here. There are certain things, there are certain disabilities that happen that are so pervasive or in such a way, usually as a result of trauma, that says like, I can love you, think you're great, but you actually can't have this job anymore. There is no accommodation we can make for you. Or, for instance, the accommodation would be such an undue hardship on the business, it wouldn't make sense to even maintain business operations anymore. That was really kind of a messed up example, but I hope you're still with me on that. That's an undue hardship. We don't need to go through each of these. The bottom line is get creative on if someone has a disability, you have the dialogue, and they're willing to say, yeah, I'll work with you to get an accommodation. There's a lot of different ways you can accommodate, and there is no place in the law where you go, well, we tried this one accommodation and it didn't work, so we fired them. No, that's called discrimination, disability discrimination. So try to be creative and create solutions. Again, sometimes you can't, but those are rare. Usually there's something to do. All right, age discrimination. Don't discriminate against people over the age of 40. I would say don't discriminate anyway based on age. It's probably not the big thing you should be caring about when you're hiring for talent. Religious discrimination. This one blows up a lot. There is constantly in the news, there's kind of identity politic kinds of stories that try to stir people up, certainly divide them by way of religion. And so you have those people, employees who see the news and come to work, and you have the devout Jewish guy next to the devout Muslim guy next to the devout Catholic guy, all having lunch together in the cafeteria. Like, what could possibly go wrong, right? So it's something we train our managers on, how to have meaningful, authentic conversations that are respectful. Different form challenges of inclusivity, but the big picture, Title VII laws of 1964, is you don't discriminate based on religion. The question is, can the person do the job? Are they the most qualified for the job? The question is not where do they go to Sabbath or synagogue or wherever on the weekends. The question is, who's the best at the job? Immigration Reform Control Act, 1986. I believe big part of this is you have 72 hours as an HR person to document two things from anybody who you hire at the company. Number one, identity. They are who they say they are. And number two, work authorization. They're legally authorized to work in the United States. A lot of people hear that and they say, okay, so I need their driver's license and proof that they're a citizen. No. There's lots of different ways people can work legally in the United States without being citizens. You have to document work authorization, meaning they're legally authorized to work in the United States. You have 72 hours to do that. You will probably have one or more I-9 audits in your life. The I-9 is the form that's completed. These are the forms, potential forms, sources of information employees can bring in where you document those two things. At some point, you will probably have an audit. I recommend, usually for companies, certainly over 50 employees, you do your own I-9 audit once a year. So you have somebody, it shouldn't take more than a day, go through, make sure you have all the right information for every employee who's there. If there's anybody missing, go collect the information. What you don't want is to be found in violation of the Immigration Reform Control Act for certainly during an investigation. In general, it's a good idea to follow the law, right? But if someone makes a complaint or there's an audit, you need to be able to produce each of these I-9 forms and the appropriate documentation. This shows A, the person who you hired is actually the person you thought you were hiring. That's their identity. And then B, they're legally authorized to work in the United States. Can you fire people because you think they're fat and ugly? Yeah. I mean, fat and ugly is not a protected category, but you got to be really careful about that. The EEOC will say, no, you can't because it's not job related. And you say, well, we hire models. Okay, maybe it's job related. Or we fired this person because they weren't like the look of the company was going for. Well, the last three people that you did that to, two were black, one was Hispanic. You haven't fired any white people because they weren't the look. That kind of seems like race discrimination. Or that guy got too fat to do his job, so we fired him. Well, that guy is clinically obese, which is a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you just discriminated against a guy with a disability. So in general, like don't mess with it. If it's a business necessity, if it's a BFOQ, well then yes, of course. But in general, you're not so concerned with how someone looks or how big or small they are in terms of weight. There are certain situations like if I want to be a pilot and I'm 4'3", well, airplanes probably aren't made for me. Or if I want to be a pilot and I'm 7'2", cockpits probably aren't made for me to sit in. So there's certain things where we go, sorry, man, you're too tall, you're too short, you're too fat, or too skinny. But those are generally pretty rare. So whatever requirements you put on there, of course, need to be specific to the job functions themselves. So all that said, we covered about 1/3 of the ways where you could get sued and screw stuff up. And more importantly, from an ethical perspective, be unfair and unjust to people, which we don't want to be doing. So that was my quick EEO talk. Could have gone for about 4 more hours. We're going to leave it there. In sum, use job-specific criteria on every employment-related decision. Who gets a raise? Who gets laid off first? Who gets hired? Who gets fired? Who gets promoted? Who gets to go on this trip with the CEO? Who gets to be in the managerial training? Whose MBA are you going to pay for? Just make sure they're job-specific criteria down the line. And with that, have a great day. That's the end of Chapter 3.